On a cold winter morning in the little mountain town of Flagstaff, the bus terminal breathed quietly beneath a pale sky. You could hear the hum of old heaters mounted high along the roof, the shuffle of boots wet from melting snow, and the softness of a coffee pot inside the diner across the street. It was the kind of morning older folks call peaceful, the kind that reminds you life still has gentle corners. Officer Henry, 63 years old and standing in his warm patrol jacket, believed the day would be just another quiet shift. Beside him walked Bruno, his Belgian Malinois partner, moving with the steady rhythm of a dog who had seen too much, survived too much, and still chose loyalty every single day. Henry took a slow sip from his metal coffee mug, unaware that within minutes, Bruno's instincts would rupture this calm like a bolt of lightning. It happened in a single breath. Bruno stopped mid-step. His body stiffened, ears pricking forward, muscles tightening beneath his vest. His gaze locked on a little girl standing near the loading bays, a child with faded pink coat and a backpack almost larger than she was. She stood beside a woman who appeared to be her guardian, though there was something unusual in the way the woman gripped her wrist, something anxious, almost rehearsed. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. Travelers hurried past, clutching tickets, adjusting scarves, calling out to loved ones. But Bruno saw what no one else did. The little girl's fingers tapped a pattern against the side of her jacket. For quick taps, then a pause, then one more. It was small, barely noticeable, the sort of gesture business would swallow whole. Yet Bruno caught it instantly. He took a step forward. Henry gently tugged the leash. "Easy, boy. What is it?" Bruno pulled harder. The girl raised her eyes for only a moment, and in that moment Henry saw something that unsettled him, a silence too heavy for a child, something hidden behind fear, something begging for someone to notice. Bruno let out a low growl, deep enough to turn heads. A few passengers paused. The woman holding the girl stiffened, pulling the child closer. Her knuckles whitened against the strap of her bag. Henry opened his mouth to say something, but Bruno cut him off, barking once, sharp, urgent, unmistakably deliberate. And with that single bark, the peaceful winter morning cracked open. No one at the station knew it yet, but the child's quiet signal and Bruno's refusal to look away were about to unveil a truth buried beneath layers of deception, a truth that would turn this ordinary bus terminal into the beginning of a story no one would ever forget. Because sometimes when fear steals a voice, it takes a hero before pause to hear the cry no one else can. Bruno's bark still echoed faintly across the terminal when the moment folded into a quieter breath. To understand why that single bark carried so much weight, you have to know the man holding the leash. Because nothing about Henry Carson's reaction that morning came from chance. It came from a lifetime of lessons, losses, and the quiet courage of a man who had seen too many winters to ignore what his heart whispered. Henry had lived in Arizona his entire life. Not the crowded parts, not the cities where lights blur into the sky, but the towns tucked against long stretches of highway and pine forests, where people still waved from their porches and called neighbors by name. At 63, Henry moved a little slower, breathed a little heavier, but carried himself with the kind of dignity only years can carve. The lines on his face spoke of storms weathered, people helped, and memories held close, even when they hurt. He had served in the military when he was young, long before his hair turned silver at the temples. Those were years that changed him, years that taught him discipline and caution, but also left with a quiet ache he never said aloud. After returning home, he joined the local police department, determined to spend whatever time he had left doing something that mattered, protecting the vulnerable, standing between danger and the innocent. It was the purpose that stitched his days together. And then life, as it often does, took from him in ways he never expected. 7 years earlier, Henry lost his wife Laura to a sudden illness, the kind that appears without warning and leaves silence in its wake. She had been the warmth of his world. After her passing, the house felt too big, too empty. Some nights, the only sound he heard was the ticking of the old clock she loved. Friends worried about him. But Henry kept showing up to work, because work was the only place that still made sense. Every morning, he drove the same route to the station, listening to an old country radio station that played songs from decades ago. Songs Laura liked. He carried a dented metal thermos she gave him on their 25th anniversary. Its paint faded from years of use. People often teased him about the mug looking older than he was, but Henry simply smiled. It was the one piece of her he could bring to work without breaking. As age crept up on him, his captain hinted gently that it might be time to think about retirement. Henry understood. His knees ached more on cold mornings. His vision took a second longer to focus. But something inside him resisted letting go. He worried that, without the badge, without the uniform, without the responsibility, he might quietly fade away. Purpose matters deeply to people his age. It keeps the heart steady and the mind awake. And that was where Bruno came in. The department assigned Bruno to Henry 2 years after his wife passed, at a time when Henry still felt half invisible to the world. Bruno was broken too, in his own way. A mission injury had nearly ended his career. Most thought he would never fully recover. But Henry saw something familiar in the dog's eyes. A kind of quiet grief, coupled with stubborn will to keep going. Two souls bruised by life, holding each other upright without needing words. Since then, the two had become inseparable. Henry talked to Bruno the way older Americans often speak to their dogs, with a softness reserved for those who never judge. In return, Bruno watched Henry with devotion only dogs understand. They healed each other in the slow, unseen ways companionship heals. And on this particular morning, as Bruno's instinct sharpened and the little girl's silent plea cut through the noise, something stirred inside Henry, a feeling he had not experienced in years. The sense that fate had placed him at the right place, at the right moment, for a reason larger than routine. The winter air, the quiet terminal, the trembling child, and the partner at his side returning to a stance of absolute alertness. Everything felt like the world whispering, "Pay attention." Because sometimes life gives a man one last chance to do something that matters, something that reminds him he is still needed, still capable, still alive. And Henry, without fully knowing why yet, understood this morning was going to test him in a way he had not been tested in decades. And just as Henry felt that familiar tightening in his chest, that sense of purpose he thought he had lost years ago, his eyes drifted down to the partner who would walk beside him through every long shift and lonely night. Understanding what was unfolding at the bus terminal meant understanding Bruno, because the dog was not simply reacting to the world around him. He was reading it, sensing it in ways no human ever could. Bruno was a Belgian Malinois, one of the most respected breeds in American law enforcement. Sleek, powerful, and intelligent, with a coat the color of desert sand and eyes that always seemed to be calculating, watching, thinking. But what made him extraordinary was not just his breed or the badge on his vest. It was a story carried quietly behind those amber eyes. 2 years earlier, Bruno had nearly lost everything. During a high-risk operation on an empty stretch of highway, he was injured while protecting his previous handler. A collision with a fleeing suspect's vehicle left his back leg badly damaged, and many believed he would never return to duty. In most departments, an injury like that means retirement. Some dogs find new homes. Some struggle to adapt. But Bruno was different. Even while recovering, he showed a determination that moved every veterinarian who worked with him. When he tried to stand before his stitches had healed, they had to gently hold him down. It was as if he refused to let go of the life he believed he was meant to live. When the department considered retiring him, Henry stepped forward in a way no one expected. He volunteered to train Bruno, to give him time, to see if there was still a spark left. Most officers admired Henry, but quietly doubted the idea. He was nearing retirement himself. Why take on a dog who had lost so much? Why start over at his age? But people over 50 often understand something younger ones do not. That healing is not about being flawless. It is about choosing to rise again every time life pushes you down. And Henry saw that in Bruno. The first weeks were slow. Bruno limped. Henry's knees ached. Training sessions took place behind the station in the early morning cold, long before the town woke up. But somewhere between those moments, between Henry's quiet encouragement and Bruno's stubborn will, they began to rebuild each other. When Bruno learned to run again, Henry smiled for the first time since his wife passed. When Bruno barked with excitement during their training drills, Henry found himself laughing, a sound he realized he had not made in months. And when Bruno was cleared to return to duty, the department saw something remarkable. The injury had not weakened him. It had sharpened him. He moved with a deeper awareness, an instinct that came from confronting vulnerability and surviving it. Many Americans of Henry's age understand exactly what that feels like. Bruno became known in the department as a dog who never ignored a silent signal. Whether it was a child trembling behind a parent or a nervous twitch from someone hiding something, Bruno caught the things people were too distracted to see. Officers trusted him. Henry trusted him most of all. And in the American spirit, where loyalty, second chances, and resilience are seen as sacred, Bruno became more than a working dog. He became a symbol, a reminder that broken things can still protect, still love, still rise again. So when Bruno stiffened at the terminal that morning, when his growl rumbled low and steady in his chest, with his eyes locked onto the trembling child, tapping her coat in the rhythm of a hidden plea, Henry felt the weight of it instantly. This was not confusion. This was not misbehavior. This was Bruno's gift. The instinct that brought him back from injury, back from doubt, back from the edge of a life unfinished. It was the same instinct telling him now. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. And standing there beneath the pale winter sky, with a hum of bus engines carrying through the air, Henry tightened his grip on the leash, not to restrain Bruno, but to steady himself for whatever truth Bruno was leading him toward. Because when a dog like Bruno takes a stand, you follow. Older Americans know this well. Sometimes it is the quietest signals that matter most. Sometimes the ones who cannot speak are the ones who understand everything. And on this morning, at this little terminal in northern Arizona, Bruno was about to prove once again that his heart, damaged though it once was, had never stopped knowing who needed saving. Bruno's sharpened instincts were remarkable. But what truly shaped that moment at the terminal was something deeper, something that cannot be taught in any training course. It was a bond, the quiet, unspoken connection between a man who had seen too many goodbyes and a dog who had fought his way back from the brink. Understanding the weight of that bond helps explain why Henry never once questioned Bruno's sudden shift in behavior. Not really. Not in his heart. Their partnership had not started like most. It did not begin with excitement or ceremony, but in the quiet corner of the station parking lot 2 years earlier, on a day when Henry felt more tired than usual and Bruno limped more than he wanted anyone to notice. The department had officially cleared Bruno for light duty, but everyone knew what that usually meant. A few weeks of paperwork, a few months of desk assignments, then retirement, for both of them. But fate works in the smallest details. Henry remembered kneeling beside Bruno that day, resting a hand on the dog's back. He felt the tension in Bruno's muscles, the frustration of wanting to run full speed again but being betrayed by a stubborn injury. Henry understood that feeling too well. His own knees had started catching on colder mornings. His breath shortened faster on stairs. The world seemed to move a little quicker than it used to, as if daring him to keep up. Maybe that is why he whispered, almost without thinking, "We're not done yet, buddy." Most people believe dogs cannot understand words. People Henry's age know better. Dogs understand tone, intention, the heaviness in your voice when you're trying to hold yourself together. They feel the truth beneath the words. Bruno lifted his head and pressed it against Henry's chest. From that moment on, something shifted. Training sessions were no longer just work. They became therapy. Henry spoke about Laura, his late wife, in a way he had not spoken to another human being since she passed. He talked about old fishing trips, his favorite winter roads in northern Arizona, how quiet the house felt at night. Bruno listened the way only dogs can, completely present, without judgment. And Bruno, in return, offered Henry a kind of loyalty that does not fade with age or injury. He learned to run again not because he had to, but because Henry believed he could. Their progress was slow at first, then steady, then astonishing. Officers who watched their drills often said it looked as though they were healing side by side, each carrying half the other's weight. Even off duty, their connection deepened. Henry took Bruno everywhere. The hardware store on weekends, the diner where the waitress always slipped Bruno a small piece of bacon, The long drives through the pine forest where Henry rolled down the window and let the cold wind fill the truck. People in town became used to seeing them together. Some even joked that Henry talked to Bruno more than he talked to other officers. Maybe that was true. But when a man loses the love of his life and finds himself standing on the edge of retirement, unsure where he fits in the world anymore, the companionship of a loyal dog can feel like a lifeline, a reminder that he is still needed, still capable, still here. And Bruno sensed all of it. Dogs like him do not simply bond. They adopt you. They claim you as their mission, their purpose, their responsibility. So on that winter morning at the bus terminal, when Bruno stopped cold and fixed his eyes on the trembling child, Henry knew without needing to understand. He felt the pull through the leash, familiar and unmistakable. The same pull that guided him through late-night patrols, through long silences, through days when getting out of bed felt heavy. It was the pull of trust. It was a pull of a bond formed not through commands, but through survival, grief, and second chances. And Henry, breathing in the crisp mountain air, tightened his grip on the leash, not to restrain Bruno, but to steady himself for what he sensed was coming. Something bigger than routine. Something that would test everything he and Bruno had rebuilt together. Because when life gives you a partner who listens even when you do not speak, who sees what your aging eyes sometimes miss, you learn one thing with absolute certainty. When that partner takes a stand, you follow. Their bond, built from grief, resilience, and quiet companionship, was the reason Henry did not brush off Bruno's sudden tension at the terminal. It was the reason he felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest as he followed the dog's unwavering gaze toward the little girl in the pink coat. And it was the reason he instinctively knew that whatever was happening in that small pocket of the crowd was not ordinary. The terminal had begun to fill quickly. Morning buses were arriving from Phoenix, Albuquerque, and smaller desert towns scattered across the southwest. Boots stamped the floor to shake off snow. Travelers clutched paper tickets between gloved fingers. A few older men warmed their hands near the heater vents while sipping diner coffee. It was a kind of everyday scene Americans are deeply familiar with, bustling, messy, yet harmless. But in the middle of all that ordinary life, something felt off. Henry noticed it first in the woman standing beside the child. Nothing obvious. It was a subtlety that unnerved him. She kept her shoulders tight, almost tucked inward, as if trying to disappear into the crowd. Her eyes flicked from one corner of the terminal to the other, not in the curious way of a traveler checking departure boards, but in the nervous rhythm of someone checking for exits, someone hiding something, someone afraid of being seen. She gripped the girl's wrist instead of her hand, an uncommon gesture for a guardian. Most mothers in America, especially on cold winter mornings, hold their children close by the palm, guiding gently. This woman held on too firmly, too deliberately. The little girl's other hand continued that tapping pattern Bruno had noticed, for soft taps, a pause, then one more, press against the side seam of her coat. The rhythm was quiet but purposeful. When Henry focused, he saw that her fingers trembled, not from the cold, from fear. Something inside him tightened. He had seen that same kind of fear once, years ago during a case he never fully recovered from. A case where a child couldn't speak the danger aloud, but signaled in small gestures, praying someone would understand. And Bruno, with his uncanny ability to sense the things humans overlook, stepped closer. Henry spoke softly, trying not to draw attention. Bruno easy. But Bruno's body stayed tense, ears pinned forward, tail lower but stiff. It was the stance of a dog listening to a silent frequency only he could hear. The woman noticed the dog's focus and reacted instantly. Her grip tightened. She pulled the child closer, almost shielding her from view. Then she changed direction, steering the girl toward the back row of lockers near the restrooms. That was strange. People waiting for buses usually stayed near the departure gates. Henry felt the shift in the air, the kind of shift seasoned officers feel long before evidence appears. He started walking, not fast enough to alarm anyone, but steady, deliberate. Bruno trotted beside him, muscles ready, breath short and controlled. As they drew closer, Henry caught the look in the girl's eyes, a look that broke something inside him. She was not just scared. She was pleading without words. The kind of plea a child makes when she has been taught to stay silent. Then it happened. Bruno let out a low rumble. Not loud, but unmistakable. The kind of warning a K9 gives only when something is very, very wrong. The woman froze. Her shoulders lifted slightly, as if preparing to flee. She glanced back at Henry, forcing a smile that did not match her eyes. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Henry asked gently, keeping his voice steady, respectful, calm, the way older officers often speak to avoid panic. She swallowed hard. "We're fine. My daughter is just tired. That's all." Her accent wavered. The lie trembled in her voice. Bruno stepped forward again, and the girl took a half step toward him, almost instinctively, before the woman yanked her back sharply. Henry's heartbeat quickened. A memory from decades earlier began to surface. Another frightened child. Another silent cry for help that no one noticed in time. This time, he thought, not again. He adjusted his stance. Senses sharpened. The terminal noise faded into the background. Every instinct honed over 3 decades of service. Every lesson from loss, every scar he carried, aligned in that moment. A quiet morning had just become something else entirely. Something dangerous. Something urgent. Something that demanded the full weight of the partnership between an aging officer and a dog who trusted him with every breath. The first thread of conflict had been pulled, revealing the beginning of a truth that would soon unravel everything. The woman's trembling voice lingered in the air, thin and uncertain, as the winter wind pressed gently against the glass doors. Henry's instincts whispered that something was wrong, but experience had taught him to gather facts before reacting. Bruno, however, was not trained to second-guess instinct. He lived in a world of signals, so subtle they slipped past human awareness. And in that moment, those signals were screaming at him. As the woman pulled the little girl closer, Bruno leaned forward, inhaling the air around her with slow, deliberate breaths. His ears twitched, capturing the murmurs behind them. The footsteps shuffling across the floor, the distant hiss of a bus engine warming up outside. But his eyes never left the child. The girl's fingers trembled again. 4 taps. A pause. One more. It was the same pattern. The same silent cry. Henry saw it too, but only after Bruno's body tensed like a stretched wire. He followed the dog's line of sight, his pulse quickening. Bruno lowered his head slightly, a gesture police handlers know all too well. It was not aggression. It was recognition. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. The girl tried to lift her eyes toward Henry and Bruno, but the woman squeezed her wrist with sharp pressure. The child winced, then lowered her gaze again. Bruno let out a soft whine that quivered in his throat, the kind that comes from empathy more than alarm. A sound older dog handlers instantly understand. It was the sound of a protector sensing fear. Henry's stomach tightened. He had seen that exact look on children's faces during cases he couldn't forget, no matter how many years had passed. A look that said, "I cannot say the words out loud. Please, see what I cannot speak." Bruno stepped forward again, inch by inch, as if carefully crossing a thin line. Every part of his body was reading hers. The shallow rise of her chest, the tremble at the corner of her mouth, the way she clutched a small stuffed toy so tightly her knuckles whitened. Children do not hide fear well. They try, but it always spills through the smallest cracks. The woman tried to redirect him again, tugging the girl toward the lockers, but Bruno shifted to block their path. His paws planted firmly on the tile, muscles coiled, ears angled forward with laser focus. Henry whispered, "Bruno, talk to me, buddy." The dog did not look back. He did not need to. Humans read words. Dogs read truth. The truth Bruno saw was unmistakable. The child was signaling for help, and she was doing it in the only way she dared. The woman tugged harder, forcing a smile that stretched unnaturally across her face. "Sorry, officer," she said. "Really, we need to get going. Long trip, lots of miles ahead." Her eyes darted away too quickly. Her grip tightened again. The girl's knees slightly buckled from the pull. Bruno's growl slipped out, not loud, not threatening, but firm, vibrating through the air like a warning bell. Several passengers glanced over. One older woman clutched her purse closer while murmuring, Something ain't right over there. Henry felt the energy shift. This was the moment every seasoned officer dreads. The moment a quiet suspicion begins to rise into undeniable truth. Bruno's stance became still as stone. His tail pointed straight back, not wagging, not tense, just ready. His breathing slowed. His pupils sharpened like amber glass. He had made his decision. Something inside that child's silence begged to be heard, and Bruno was done waiting. Henry's voice dropped to a low murmur, the tone of a man who knows he is standing at the edge of something larger than himself. "All right, partner," he whispered. "I'm listening." Because while Henry's human heart wavered between caution and fear, Bruno saw only one thing: danger wrapped in silence. And the moment a dog like Bruno chooses to defend a child, everything changes. Bruno's low growl still vibrated through Henry's hand, but as the noise of the terminal swirled around him, announcements echoing, footsteps scattering across the tile, the faint rattle of a vending machine, Henry felt a different sound rising inside him, a whisper he had learned to fear with age, a whisper that questioned everything he thought he still was. He blinked, steadying his breath, tried to read the situation the way he had done thousands of times throughout his career. But the older he grew, the more he knew that instincts sometimes blur, memories distort, and confidence wavers. And in moments like this, doubt, quiet but sharp, can slip under a man's skin before he can stop it. He looked again at the woman, at the tight grip on the girl's wrist, at the forced smile stretched too thin, at the child's trembling fingers tapping that same silent pattern. It all felt wrong. But what if he was misreading it? He was 63. His eyesight was not what it used to be. His hearing sometimes softened when the terminal grew loud, and he knew better than anyone that older officers sometimes saw danger in shadows, as younger recruits often teased. Was he letting old ghosts from past cases cloud his judgment? His thoughts flickered back to a case decades ago, a child he couldn't save because he hesitated, because he waited for confirmation, because he trusted paperwork over instinct. That memory had carved itself deep into him, leaving a scar he carried quietly, hidden beneath his uniform and his years. But now, standing in front of a trembling child, that same scar pulsed. Henry shifted his weight. His knee cracked faintly, a reminder of the years behind him. He exhaled slowly, tasting uncertainty at the back of his throat. His captain had mentioned retirement again just last week, gently but firmly, the way people do when they worry you might be holding on too tightly. Was this moment proof that they were right? Was he overreacting? Was he letting fear speak louder than fact? Bruno glanced up at him, eyes sharp, certain, almost pleading in their own way. The dog saw no gray areas, no what-ifs, no second-guessing. He saw a child in danger. He saw truth in silence. And Henry felt that truth pulling at him. But the logical part of his mind kept whispering doubts he couldn't shake. What if the woman really was the girl's mother? What if the child was simply anxious or tired or cold? What if Bruno was reacting to something harmless, a scent, a sound, a movement Henry could not see? What if he stepped in and caused unnecessary panic? The weight of responsibility pressed against his chest, heavy and familiar. Officers his age know this weight well. The older you get, the more aware you become of the consequences of every action. The paperwork, the scrutiny, the judgment from younger colleagues who question whether you still belong on the force. Henry's heart tugged in two directions. One side begged caution. The other begged courage. His hand tightened around the leash, and he felt Bruno leaning slightly forward, quietly urging him to trust, not himself, but the bond they had built. The bond that had never once failed them. But doubt lingered, stubborn and persistent. Henry swallowed hard, his voice a low whisper only Bruno could hear. "What if I'm wrong, buddy?" Bruno didn't flinch, didn't waver. He simply stared at the child with a focus so intense it felt like certainty itself. And that certainty made Henry's doubt crack, just slightly. He took a slow breath, pushing past the noise, past his age, past his fear of making a mistake. He looked at the girl again. Her eyes flinched when the woman tugged her wrist. Her shoulders curled inward, as if she were trying to make herself small. Her tapping hand trembled with a message she could not voice. Henry's doubts didn't disappear, but they shifted, softened, became something he could move through rather than be trapped beneath. Because even in a man's later years, even when certainty slips and confidence wavers, there are moments when the heart knows what the mind hesitates to accept. And as Bruno growled again, deeper this time, Henry felt that quiet truth rising like a tide. Age may shake his confidence. Memory may blur his instincts. But compassion, that stayed sharp. And compassion told him this was not nothing. This was not normal. This was not a misunderstanding he could walk away from. Something was wrong. And if he ignored it, he might never forgive himself. Henry's doubt still churned inside him like a slow-moving storm, heavy and familiar. But before he could steady his thoughts, Bruno made the decision for him. It happened in a heartbeat, as if the dog knew that hesitation could cost something precious, something irreplaceable. And in Bruno's world, protecting the vulnerable was not a question. It was instinct. The woman tugged the little girl again, sharper this time, the kind of tug that makes a child stumble. The girl's small shoes scraped across the tile as she tried to keep her balance. Her tapping stopped, replaced by a silent wince that tightened her shoulders and curled her fingers inward. That was the moment Bruno moved. The leash pulled taut so quickly that it snapped Henry's arm forward. Bruno stepped directly into their path, lowering his body just enough to signal warning, not aggression. His ears flattened, his stance wide and anchored. He positioned himself between the girl and the woman with precision that only years of training and something deeper could create. "Bruno, heel," Henry commanded, his voice instinctively firm. But Bruno did not heel. He did not retreat, did not even glance back for permission. Instead, he took another step forward, planting himself like a living barrier, a silent declaration, a line drawn in the sand. "Bruno," Henry repeated, softer now, confusion knotting up inside him. "I said heel." Still nothing. Bruno's refusal hit Henry harder than he expected. During their years together, the dog had never ignored a direct order. Not once. Not during searches. Not during late-night patrols. Not even during the long recovery when pain made every movement a struggle. Bruno listened because loyalty was a heartbeat of his nature. But now, faced with a silent child and a woman whose composure was unraveling thread by thread, Bruno broke that obedience without hesitation. Something inside Henry snapped into focus. The woman's face paled. She pulled the girl behind her as if trying to shield her, but the gesture was wrong, protective in appearance, controlling in intent. Her eyes darted left and right, searching for an exit, calculating distance, measuring risk. She wasn't offended by Bruno's intrusion. She was afraid of it. "Please," she hissed, her voice cracking. "Your dog is scaring my daughter." Bruno growled again, deeper, more certain. His eyes never left the girl. The girl's trembling grew more visible, her breathing shallow. Her gaze flicking to Bruno with something that looked painfully close to hope. Henry felt the room tilt. The doubt he had been wrestling with slowly loosened its hold. He watched as the girl raised her free hand, the one not trapped in the woman's grip. She didn't tap this time. She simply extended 2 fingers ever so slightly, then lowered them quickly when the woman pulled her closer. It was a gesture Henry recognized from past training seminars, a discreet distress signal taught to children in dangerous situations. Something only kids in trouble used. Something most adults overlooked because it was small, quiet, almost invisible. But Bruno saw it, and Henry finally did too. Henry drew a breath, steadying himself. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm going to need you to stop right there." The woman stiffened. "We have a bus to catch." "Maybe," Henry answered, eyes locked on her trembling hand as it gripped the child's wrist too tightly. "But not yet." Bruno inched forward again, placing his body firmly between the two, his tail low but unwavering, his head angled in a protective arc over the child. He was not threatening. He was shielding. Passengers nearby began to murmur. A man in a flannel jacket stepped back. A mother with a stroller paused mid-stride. The air shifted, thickening with unease, curiosity, and something else, a sense that the truth was beginning to surface. Henry's pulse thudded in his ears, but not from fear now, from clarity. Bruno had made his choice. He had chosen the child, and that meant Henry had to follow. Age may slow a man's steps, may shake his confidence, may even cloud his mind with memories he wishes he could rewrite. But it does not dim the responsibility to protect. It does not silence a lifetime of service. Henry placed a hand gently on Bruno's back, feeling the tension coil beneath the fur. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though the words were more for himself than the dog. Then he looked directly at the woman. "I'm going to ask you one more time. Is everything all right?" Her mouth opened, but no words came. The girl, hidden partly behind her, lifted her eyes to Bruno, and in that shared glance between dog and child, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The girl's eyes lingered on Bruno, wide, hopeful, pleading, and for a brief moment the world around them seemed to freeze. But the spell broke the instant the woman realized she was losing control of the situation. Her entire posture shifted, sharp and defensive, like someone cornered by truth rather than danger. She jerked the girl behind her with a force that made the child stumble. Henry's breath caught. The movement was small, but unmistakably wrong, and the older passengers watching from nearby benches reacted with soft gasps, the kind only people with years of lived experience can recognize. Gasps that say, "I've seen this before and it is never good." The woman's voice, when it came, was coated with a thin layer of panic. She tried desperately to hide. "Officer," she said, tightening her grip until the girl winced again. "I told you we're fine. We're just late. My daughter is frightened of dogs, that's all." But her words quivered and her eyes flicked down. Not at the child, not at Bruno, but at the bag slung over her shoulder as if checking something inside. Something she didn't want anyone to see. Henry caught the glance immediately. So did Bruno. The dog moved forward, not aggressively, but with a certainty that cut straight through the woman's composure. His tail lowered, his chest expanded slightly, and he let out a controlled, deliberate bark. One single note that echoed with authority, the kind that turns every head within earshot. The woman flinched. For the first time, real fear flashed through her expression. "Back your dog up," she snapped, her voice rising in a tone far too sharp, too angry, for a mother supposedly protecting her child. "He's out of control." But Henry heard the tremor beneath her words, the kind that cannot be faked. And something inside him, something older, steadier, forged from decades of service, settled into clarity. "Ma'am," he said slowly, voice calm but firmer than before, "your daughter seems scared, but she's not looking at me. She's looking at my dog, and she's been signaling him since we walked in." The woman's jaw tightened. "She's not signaling anything." Bruno barked again, shorter, more urgent. This time he stepped sideways, positioning himself squarely between Henry and the girl, body low, eyes locked on the woman's bag, now clutched against her side. Passengers took a cautious step back. The tension thickened around them like frost on the windows. The woman's breathing grew uneven. Her fingers twitched against the strap of her bag, and her eyes darted toward the terminal door in a way that sent a ripple up Henry's spine. She wasn't looking for help. She was looking for escape. "Ma'am," Henry repeated, his voice carrying the weight of 63 years and a lifetime of knowing when fear meant guilt. "I need you to take your hand off that child's wrist." For a split second, something in her expression cracked. Guilt, anger, desperation, all flashing at once. Then she forced a smile so stiff it looked painful. "We really don't have time for this." She tugged the child again, but the girl didn't move. This time, she resisted, barely, but enough. She leaned a fraction of an inch toward Bruno, her body trembling, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't. Her eyes glistened with tears she tried to blink away. The woman saw it, and panic surged across her face. Henry saw it too, and in that moment, there was no room left for doubt. Bruno stepped forward, issuing a low growl that rolled across the tile floor like distant thunder. Not a threat, an alert, a warning, a call to action. The woman's composure finally shattered. She snapped, "Stay away from us." Her voice cracked as she tried to pull the child behind her once more. "You don't understand." Henry's voice dropped to a whisper, steady and calm, the way only older officers with decades of heartbreak behind them can speak. "Then help me understand, ma'am." But she didn't answer with words. She answered with fear. Her grip faltered, Just for a second, but that single second was enough to tell Henry everything he needed to know. This was no mother protecting her child. This was someone trying to escape with her. And Bruno, faithful, bruised, relentless Bruno, had been right from the very beginning. The woman's panicked outburst hung in the air like a cracked bell, and for a long second, everything inside the terminal fell unnaturally still. Even the overhead speaker, which had been announcing arrivals and delays just moments earlier, seemed to fall quiet, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Henry felt the shift down to his bones. It was the unmistakable moment when concern turns into certainty, when suspicion hardens into truth, and that truth was staring back at him through the frightened eyes of a little girl who still hadn't said a single word. The woman tried again to force a smile, but her face twitched, betraying the unraveling beneath the surface. "Officer," she muttered, voice tight and trembling. "This is unnecessary. We really need to get going. You're making her nervous." Henry didn't respond right away. His eyes drifted to the girl's wrist, the one trapped in the woman's grip. A faint red mark had begun to form on the skin, small but unmistakable against the pale winter light. Something inside him clenched. He stepped closer. "Ma'am, let go of her. Now." But the woman didn't let go. Instead, she pulled the child back with a frantic jolt, a move so desperate it knocked the girl off balance. She nearly fell before catching herself on the corner of a metal bench. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few people stood up. An elderly man shook his head, muttering under his breath, "That's not right. That's just not right." Bruno growled, louder this time, his body crouched low, ears pinned to protective instinct burning like a signal flare. Yet even then, he didn't lunge or bark wildly. He simply stood between the child and danger, unshakable, immovable, a living shield. The woman's eyes darted around the room again, wide and frantic. Every exit seemed too far, every observer a potential witness. Fear rolled off her in waves so sharp even the air felt tense. Then, in a last attempt to regain control, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a thin plastic folder. "Here," she snapped, shoving it toward Henry. "This is her documentation. Birth certificate, school ID, everything. You can check for yourself." Henry took the folder, his heart sinking the moment he touched it. Not because the documents looked obviously fake. At first glance, they didn't. They were crisp, neatly arranged, and printed on what anyone might assume was official paper. But they were too crisp, too neat, too perfect. A lifetime in law enforcement teaches a man that real documents often show life on their edges, wrinkles, smudges, the software being used. These looked untouched. Created, not carried. Henry flipped through the papers anyway, jaw tightening. His vision, slightly blurry at the edges from age and stress, made it harder to focus. His doubts clawed him again, whispering old fears. What if you're misreading this? What if your mind is playing tricks? What if you cause a scene over nothing? He blinked hard, refocusing. Bruno nudged Henry's leg with his nose. Hard, purposeful. A reminder from a partner who trusted instinct above anything else. Henry steadied himself, taking a slow breath. When he looked up again, he caught a tiny movement. The girl raised her free hand behind the woman's back and traced the same silent distress signal. She had been tapping against her coat. 4 taps. A pause. And one more. His heart dropped. At that exact moment, the woman snatched the folder back from Henry's hand, as if suddenly realizing she had shown too much. "We're done here," she snapped. "Come on, sweetie." She yanked the girl forward. The child's breath hit sharply. Henry reached out instinctively. "Stop." But the woman didn't stop. She bolted, dragging the girl with her, weaving through the crowd with the panicked desperation of someone who knew the truth had finally slipped through her fingers. Chairs clattered to the floor. Passengers shouted in alarm. The terminal erupted into chaos. For a split second, Henry froze, his mind scrambling to catch up, his aging knees aching as adrenaline surged through him. His doubts screamed one last time, loud and sharp, threatening to paralyze him. What if you can't keep up? What if your body fails you? What if you're too late? Again? That was the point of no return. The moment when doubt could either cripple him or push him forward. Then Bruno made the choice for both of them. He lunged, not in aggression, but in absolute, unwavering duty. The leash whipped from Henry's hand as the dog charged after the fleeing woman and the terrified child she dragged behind her. And Henry, heart pounding, fear roaring in his chest, did the only thing he could. He ran, not like a man of 63, not like a man weighed down by grief or age or old memories, but like a man who understood that sometimes life gives you one last chance to do something that matters, one last chance to save someone who cannot save themselves. And he was not going to lose this child. Not again. Chaos rippled to the terminal as the woman dragged the girl toward the exit, her movements frantic and wild. But Bruno was already in motion, muscle, instinct, and purpose fused into one unstoppable force. For an instant, Henry saw only the blur of tan fur and the sharp glint of determination in Bruno's eyes. Then the dog was gone, weaving through overturned chairs and startled passengers with precision no human could ever hope to match. Henry pushed after them, breath burning in his chest, but he knew, as every older officer eventually learns, that age and gravity do not negotiate. His knees protested, his stride faltered, yet he kept going, driven by fear and a rush of adrenaline that felt almost painful. But even running at full speed, he could see it clearly. He would never catch them in time. Not on his own. Not at 63. Not with the woman already forcing the girl toward the sliding doors. And that was the moment Bruno did something that defied logic, something training alone couldn't explain. Instead of charging straight toward the woman, Bruno lunged sideways, veering sharply to a row of vending machines and the metal trash bin beside them. Henry watched, stunned, as the dog kicked off the slick tile floor and propelled himself upward, using the edge of the trash bin as a springboard. His body arched midair, soaring higher than physics should have allowed, clearing a cluster of passengers who ducked in shock. Gasps erupted across the terminal. A woman clutched her chest. A man dropped his coffee. Someone whispered, "No way. No way that dog just did that." Bruno hit the ground running, now ahead of the woman. He cut across her path with surgical precision, skidding slightly on the tile but recovering instantly. The woman's eyes widened in terror as she realized Bruno had outmaneuvered her. She tried to pivot, dragging the terrified girl behind her, but it was too late. Bruno didn't attack. He didn't bite. He didn't even bark. Instead, in an act of instinct so precise it bordered on supernatural, he lunged forward just enough to clamp his teeth onto the strap of the woman's shoulder bag. Not her body, not the child, just the bag. One firm tug sent the woman stumbling backward. The bag ripped open, scattering its contents across the floor like a burst of secrets. Burner phones, loose cash, a folded map marked with bus routes across the Southwest. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. The woman shrieked, scrambling to gather the items, but Bruno stepped over the spilled evidence, standing guard, growling low and steady. His stare pinned her to the spot. The little girl, momentarily released in the chaos, stumbled backward into Henry's arms as he finally reached them, breathless, shaken, but resolute. "Sweetheart," Henry whispered, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're safe now." The girl clung to him, her small fingers gripping the fabric of his jacket, her body trembling with relief that seemed to pour out of her all at once. But the woman, wild-eyed, frantic, was not done fighting. She lunged forward with one last burst of desperation, reaching for the girl. Bruno moved before Henry even saw it. The dog stepped between them, lowering his body protectively, lips curled just enough to show he meant business if she dared try again. The growl that rose from his chest was not loud, but it was primal, an ancient sound that every living creature understands. A warning, a line she could not cross. The woman froze. Her hand dropped. Her fight was gone. Passengers began pulling out their phones. Others stepped in to block the woman's escape. Even the bus driver standing near the entrance shook his head in disbelief. Henry stayed focused on the girl, but his voice trembled when he spoke. "Good boy, Bruno, good boy." Because what Bruno had done was more than instinct, more than training, more than heroism. It was something no human could have predicted, something no handler could have commanded, something that seemed to come from a place beyond logic, beyond fear, beyond reason. A sixth sense, a gift, a miracle in motion. And as Henry held the girl close, feeling the weight of her small frame and the shiver of her breath against his chest, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. Bruno had not just stopped a kidnapping. He had stopped a tragedy. He had done the impossible because he refused to accept the ordinary, because he listened to the silent plea no one else could hear, because he acted when human doubt threatened to hold him back. This was a moment, the unbelievable moment, when a dog saved a life not by teeth or force, but by seeing a truth buried in silence and doing what no one else dared. The scattered contents of a torn bag still lay across the floor, phones, cash, maps, evidence that told a story louder than any confession. But the moment the woman realized escape was slipping through her fingers, something changed in her eyes. Panic ignited into desperation, a kind of frantic energy that makes people do reckless things. With a sudden burst of movement, she shoved two passengers aside and bolted toward the glass doors that led out to the parking lot. Chairs toppled. A coffee cup spilled across the tile. Someone yelled for security. The little girl let out a quiet cry as Henry held her close, but his eyes were already on the woman, watching her sprint into the cold winter morning. "Bruno!" Henry shouted, pointing toward the exit. But Bruno didn't need direction. He was already in motion. The automatic doors hissed open just as she burst through them, the frigid Arizona wind whipping her coat sideways. The parking lot stretched wide before her, rows of cars dusted with melting snow, a delivery truck idling near the loading zone, and a city bus slowly backing out, its reverse alarm beeping in steady rhythm. Most people would hesitate, but desperation is a powerful driver. She ran straight into the chaos. Bruno shot out of the terminal like a force of nature, paused skidding for half a second on the icy concrete before he found traction. His breath puffed into the cold air as he lunged forward, closing distance with terrifying speed. Passengers gathered at the doors, watching the scene unfold like something out of a crime drama they never expected to witness in real life. Henry followed as fast as his aging legs allowed, lungs burning, the cold biting deep into his chest. Every step reminded him of the years he'd lived, the battles he'd fought, and the body that no longer moved the way it once had. But he kept going, driven by the fear that if he failed to follow, if he failed to act now, he might relive the grief of a child he once couldn't save. Bruno raced ahead. The woman darted between parked cars, weaving through the rows with wild, erratic strides. A sedan pulled into a space just as she sprinted past, the driver slamming on the brakes in shock. She nearly slipped on a patch of ice, but caught herself against the bumper of a pickup truck before pushing off again. Bruno leapt over the same patch of ice without breaking stride. Then came the moment that made every viewer inside the terminal gasp. The city bus, 30,000 pounds of steel, was still reversing. Its alarm beeped steadily, echoing across the parking lot. The driver's view was partially blocked by morning frost on the rear window. The woman, blinded by panic, ran directly behind it. She didn't see it, but Bruno did. With a burst of impossible speed, he veered sharply, cutting across the woman's path. His claws scraped against the asphalt as he pushed his body harder, faster, further than injury or age or physics should have allowed. A man watching from the sidewalk shouted, "Watch out!" as Bruno lowered his body and threw his weight into her legs, not to harm her, but to stop her. She fell forward with a cry, her palms skidding across the frozen ground. The bus rolled past him by inches. If Bruno hadn't acted in that split second of instinct, the outcome would have been unthinkable. The bus driver finally slammed the brakes, confused by the scene behind him. Bruno stood in front of the woman now, body lowered, tail stiff, blocking her path with the same unwavering resolve he showed with the child inside the terminal. Henry reached him moments later, panting hard, one hand pressed against the stitch in his side. Another officer, alerted by the commotion, ran out of the terminal with a radio in hand. The woman tried to scramble away, but Bruno shifted again, cutting off her escape. His movements were precise, measured, controlled, every inch of him the definition of a trained K-9 who had chosen justice over fear. Henry raised a trembling hand, not to restrain the dog, but to steady himself as the weight of the moment settled in. "Bruno, you did it," he whispered, voice shaking. The woman looked up at him, her face pale, streaked with cold air and panic. For the first time, there was no lie in her eyes, no forced smile, no attempt at manipulation, only defeat. Cars idled. Snowflakes drifted. The beeping of the bus slowed, then stopped, and in the stillness of that winter parking lot, something undeniable became clear. Bruno had done the impossible, not because he was commanded, not because he was trained to chase, but because he understood the stakes. He saw what others couldn't. He acted when others froze. He protected a child by outrunning fear itself. It was a moment so unbelievable, so extraordinary, that no one watching would ever forget it. And for Henry, out of breath, knees aching, heart pounding, there was only one truth left. This was no ordinary dog. This was a partner sent by fate, one who refused to let innocence slip away again. The woman's fall slowed her for only a heartbeat. Panic has a way of driving people beyond reason, and she scrambled back to her feet with renewed desperation. Her boots slipped on the melting snow as she pushed off the pavement, looking for any opening that might give her one last chance to escape. Her breath came in sharp, frantic bursts. Her eyes darted from car to car, searching for a gap wide enough to disappear into. But Bruno was already there. He closed the remaining distance with incredible precision, his paws carving through the thin layer of frost across the asphalt. He moved like a force pulled by something deeper than instinct, a force shaped by loyalty, sharpened by pain, and fueled by a purpose he had chosen for himself. The woman lunged toward a narrow space between two parked trucks, but Bruno slid into the path before she could squeeze through. He planted his feet firmly, shoulders squared, chest forward, blocking her with every ounce of strength his body carried. There was no aggression in his stance, only certainty, the kind of certainty that ends a chase. "Move," she shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of fear. "Get out of my way." Bruno didn't move, not an inch. His eyes locked onto hers, steady, piercing, unyielding. It was a look that said he had already measured the distance, judged the danger, and made his choice long before she even finished her sentence. She tried to sidestep left, and Bruno mirrored her instantly, cutting her off. She tried right. He cut her off again. Precise, controlled, relentless. Behind them, Henry finally reached the edge of the chase, leaning forward with one hand pressed to the hood of the car as he fought to steady his breathing. His heart pounded so fiercely it felt like it shook his rib cage. Years of service had taught him many things, but nothing prepared him for the sight unfolding just a few feet away. A 63-year-old man, breathless and aging, and a dog, bruised, scarred, underestimated, doing the work of 10 officers. Henry straightened slowly, pushing past the pain knotted in his chest. "Bruno," he called hoarsely. "Hold." Bruno didn't need the command, but he held anyway. The woman tried one more desperate move. She lunged forward, hoping to slip past Bruno's right flank. But Bruno shifted faster than she could blink, cutting her path with flawless timing. His muscles tensed, his stance widened, and he lowered his body just enough to signal a warning, without crossing the line into force. His growl rumbled low and steady, an unmistakable message etched into sound. "Don't. Not another step." The woman froze. The fight drained out of her shoulders. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the cold wind whipped her hair across her face. Henry walked toward them, his steps slower than he wanted, but steady. Each footfall echoed with a lifetime's worth of knowledge. Every loss, every case, every night he went home wondering whether he had done enough. And now, watching Bruno hold the line with perfect control, Henry felt a surge of pride so deep it bordered on awe. "Ma'am," he said, voice firm and unshakable. "It's over." The woman's knees buckled. She sank to the ground, her hands trembling against the cold asphalt. For the first time, the full weight of reality hit her, and the fight slipped out of her entirely. Bruno stayed where he was, standing guard, steady as a stone carved by the wind. A bystander in a heavy winter coat stepped forward cautiously. "Officer," he said quietly, "that dog, he saved that child." Henry didn't take his eyes off the woman. He simply nodded once. "Yes," he murmured, his voice roughened by emotion. "He did." He slowly approached Bruno and knelt just enough to rest a trembling hand on the dog's back. Bruno's muscles, tight with focus a moment earlier, softened at Henry's touch. But he didn't take his eyes off the woman. Not yet. Not until he knew the child was truly safe. "Good boy," Henry whispered. "You did exactly what needed to be done." Sirens began to wail in the distance. Backup arriving. People emerged from the terminal. Some with hands over their mouths. Others with phones held low, unwilling to miss a moment of what they'd just witnessed. A few older men whispered to each other, their voices thick with awe. "That's a real working dog. That's loyalty. That's an American hero right there." Bruno remained still, standing proudly between danger and the world he had sworn to protect. Not because anyone commanded him to, but because something inside him refused to let innocence be taken again. And in that frozen parking lot, beneath a pale winter sun, Henry understood a truth as sharp as the cold itself. This was not just a chase. This was fate delivering justice through the instincts of a dog who saw what humans nearly missed. The echoes of the sirens grew louder, bouncing off the snowy pavement and tall concrete walls of the parking lot. But Henry barely heard them. His focus narrowed on the woman kneeling on the asphalt, her breath ragged, her shoulders trembling, her eyes darting like someone whose lies had finally cracked open. And standing over her, steady and sure, Bruno kept watch, silent, resolute, unshakably calm. Henry stepped closer, the cold biting at his cheeks, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs, but his voice remained steady. "Ma'am," he said softly, "it's time to tell me who you really are." At first, she said nothing, just stared at the ground, jaw clenched, fingers twitching against the pavement. Her denial seemed to hang by a thread, thin, desperate, ready to snap. The little girl, still tucked safely behind Henry, peeked out from his side. The fear in her eyes had softened slightly, replaced by something fragile, something that looked almost like hope. Henry's heart tightened. "Sweetheart," he murmured, kneeling beside her. "Are you all right?" She nodded, but the gesture was small, hesitant, the kind of nod a child gives after surviving something they cannot yet put into words. One of the officers arriving on scene approached Henry carefully, lifting evidence bags of the items spilled from the torn shoulder bag. "Sir," the officer said, voice low, "you need to see this." Henry took the bag, his gloved hands trembling as he examined the contents more closely under the pale winter light. A burner phone, its screen cracked, but still glowing faintly. A stack of bus tickets under different names, all purchased within the last 24 hours. A piece of notepaper scribbled with highway numbers and rest stop locations stretching across 3 states. And tucked in the very bottom, a single child's bracelet, beaded and broken, as if ripped off in a struggle. Henry felt a coldness worse than the winter air spreading through his chest. "This isn't her daughter," the officer whispered beside him. "She's been moving around with different kids, all along the interstate system." A chill settled over the gathered crowd. A woman gasped softly. An older man shook his head in disbelief. Henry's throat tightened. "Ma'am," he said, voice sterner now, "you need to explain this. Right now." The woman's composure finally cracked. Her shoulders sagged, and she let out a broken, breathless sound halfway between anger and surrender. "You don't understand," she said hoarsely. "I had no choice." Henry felt Bruno shift beside him, muscles tensing as the dog watched her every movement. "No choice." Henry echoed, his jaw tightening. "You dragged a child." She signaled for help. "You tried to run into a moving bus." He paused, his voice lowering into something heavier. "You had choices. You just didn't choose her." The woman's eyes filled with something complicated, fear, guilt, and a kind of frantic desperation that had been driving her since the moment Bruno first sensed something was wrong. "I wasn't hurting her," she insisted, but her voice faltered under the weight of her own lie. "They told me to take her. They said they'd let me go if I—" She cut herself off, pressing shaky hands to her face. Henry exhaled slowly, the truth settling into place like falling snow. Quiet, heavy, undeniable. The child was never safe with her. The woman was part of something larger, and Bruno had seen it long before any human could. Henry turned to the little girl. "Sweetheart," he asked gently, "is she your mother?" The girl's lips pressed together. Tears welled in her eyes. Then she shook her head. Slow, certain, The truth spoken without a single word. That was it. Everything Henry needed. He pressed a hand to Bruno's shoulder, grounding himself in the tremor of emotion that rolled through him. Pride, relief, sorrow, fury. It all collided inside him at once. "You saved her," Henry whispered, voice thick. "You really saved her." Bruno's gaze lifted, steady and calm, as if he understood. The woman was handcuffed moments later. Officers guided her to the waiting patrol car as she muttered fragmented excuses, none of them holding weight anymore. The evidence lay scattered behind her, revealed in the cold light of morning. Every piece confirming the story Bruno had sensed before any human eye had noticed a thing. One of the arriving officers approached Henry again. "How did your dog know?" he asked quietly in awe. Henry looked at Bruno, his partner, his healer, his miracle. "He listens," Henry said simply. "He listens to the things we forget to pay attention to." The little girl reached out then, her tiny fingers brushing Bruno's fur. He lowered his head to her gently, his posture softening for the first time since the chase began. The child leaned into him, burying her face in his neck with a quiet sob. And in that moment, the entire truth came into focus. Not through documents or confessions or procedures, but through the unwavering instinct of a dog who refused to ignore a child's silent cry for help. Unbelievable, yet undeniably real. Because sometimes the truth doesn't shout. Sometimes it trembles behind a frightened child's eyes. And sometimes it takes a heart like Bruno's to reveal it. The patrol car door closed behind the woman with a dull, echoing thud, but the sound barely registered. Henry wasn't listening to the clatter of handcuffs or the muffled radio chatter filling the parking lot. His whole world had narrowed to the small child clutching his jacket with trembling fingers, and the dog who had refused to let her disappear into silence. As the last of the morning sirens faded, the girl slowly lifted her head from Bruno's neck. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, her nose red from the cold, her small body shaking not from weather, but from everything she'd held inside for too long. Henry crouched down, his knees aching as they always did, but he ignored the pain. "Sweetheart," he whispered, his voice soft enough to soothe, steady enough to promise safety. "You're okay now. You're safe." The girl didn't answer with words. Instead, she reached out a trembling hand and placed it gently on Bruno's snout, her fingers brushing the fur just below his eyes. Bruno lowered his head even more, as if trying to make himself small, gentle, comforting, an anchor for a child whose world had nearly been stolen. Then it happened, the moment that broke everyone watching. With a shuddering breath, the little girl wrapped her arms around Bruno's neck as tightly as her small frame allowed. Her sobs came soft at first, then deeper, pouring out like a dam finally giving way. Not loud, not dramatic, just heartbreakingly honest. The kind of cry that comes from a child who finally realizes she no longer has to be brave. Bruno didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't shift his weight or flick an ear. He simply stood there, steady and unshakable, letting her hold on to him as if he were the only solid thing left in her world. His breath came slow and calm, grounding her, each rise and fall of his chest telling her, "I'm here. You're safe. I'm not going anywhere." A woman standing near the terminal door covered her mouth, tears pooling in her eyes. A man in a trucker's jacket wiped at his face, trying to hide the emotion behind rough hands. Even one of the younger officers, someone who had spent years pretending nothing could move him, blinked hard against the sting in his eyes. Because there is something universally powerful about a child finding safety again. Something ancient, something sacred, something that reminds every adult, especially older Americans, what innocence is worth protecting. The girl finally pulled back just enough to look up at Henry. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He saved me." Henry swallowed hard, the words striking a place in him he hadn't opened in decades. "Yes," he said, his own voice trembling. "He did." Then the girl did something that shattered what little composure Henry had left. She reached out softly, cautiously, and placed her small hand in his. Her fingers curled around his thumb like a child reaching for a father she wished she had. Henry felt the weight of that gesture, felt it settle into the cracks of grief he thought would never heal. "You came," she whispered. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, fighting back tears he didn't expect. The memory of another child, another case, another failure pulled at him. But this time the ending was different. This time he had arrived in time. This time he had someone beside him who refused to let doubt win. He squeezed her hand gently. "We came," he corrected her softly. "Bruno and I. We heard you." Bruno nudged her again, as if agreeing. The girl's lip quivered. Nobody else did. Henry looked at Bruno, his partner, his lifeline, the miracle he hadn't known he needed until he found him. "He heard you first," Henry murmured. "He always does." And for a long, quiet moment, the three of them stayed like that, an aging officer, a scarred dog, and a fragile child, held together by the simplest and most powerful truth. Sometimes the smallest cry for help is heard by the one heart brave enough to listen. It was a moment that made strangers cry, officers swallow hard, and anyone watching feel something they hadn't felt in a long time. A reminder that goodness still exists, that miracles still happen, and that heroes sometimes walk on four paws. For a long moment, the entire parking lot existed in that hush, the kind that follows a miracle and precedes a truth. Officers moved with careful purpose. The child stayed close to Henry, and Bruno stood watch, silent, steady, as if nothing could shift him from his post now that the danger had passed. But the story wasn't finished, not even close, because every rescue is just the beginning of a deeper truth, one that law enforcement must follow to its final, undeniable end. It didn't take long for the FBI liaison assigned to missing children in the region to arrive. A black SUV rolled into the lot, tires crunching over old ice. The agent stepped out with calm, focused expressions, flashing their badges as local officers briefed them. Henry handed over the evidence bag containing the burner phone, ticket stubs, and the crumpled map marked with rest stop numbers. The lead agent, a woman in her early 50s with silver streaks in her hair and eyes that carried the exhaustion of years spent chasing the worst parts of humanity, knelt beside the scattered items. She studied them with a quiet intensity. "This isn't random," she murmured. "This is organized, planned, coordinated." She glanced at Henry. "And you said your dog was the first to catch on?" Henry rubbed a trembling hand over his face, the weight of the morning settling into his bones. He didn't hesitate. He knew before any of us did. The agent nodded slowly, her gaze shifting to Bruno with something like respect. Some dogs are born with a sense of understanding that goes beyond scent or sound. They read fear like we read words. She paused, then added softly, "We could use that today." As officers secured the suspect in a transport vehicle, a small crowd gathered at a respectful distance. The winter wind carried faint whispers. "That dog saved that little girl. God bless that officer. This world needs heroes like them." But inside the circle of law enforcement, the real work began. Agents pulled the SIM trays from the burner phones, logging serial numbers and cross-referencing recent purchases. A tech specialist scanned the map, highlighting the rest stops that matched ongoing reports of missing children. What looked like scraps of paper and random routes now wove themselves into a chilling pattern. Henry watched silently, the girl still holding onto his sleeve. She hadn't let go since the moment she felt safe enough to cry, and Bruno remained close, positioning himself between her and the world. "Officer Carson." The agent's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "We're heading out to check one of these locations. A warehouse outside of Winslow. It's remote, barely used, but it appears on this map twice." She held up the evidence. The timing matches recent abductions across Arizona and New Mexico. Henry felt his pulse thrum in his ears. "Do you think she was working with others?" "I'd bet my badge on it," the agent said quietly. "And if she was transporting children through bus routes, someone else was receiving them." A cold wave rolled through Henry, heavier than the winter air. He looked down at the girl, who kept her small fingers hooked around the cuff of his jacket. Her eyes were hollow, sad but present, trusting him. Then he looked at Bruno, calm, alert, ready. "Bring him," the agent said suddenly, jerking her chin toward the dog. "If anyone can find the rest of this operation, it's him." Henry blinked. "You want Bruno at a federal search site?" "I want the dog who saved this child," she answered, "and who saw the truth before any of us." The decision wasn't difficult. Henry nodded once. "We'll go." Within minutes, Bruno hopped into the back of the FBI SUV, settling onto the padded mat laid across the seat. His eyes remained trained on the girl until the very last second, until Henry gently eased her into the arms of a child services officer who promised to stay with her, not leave her side, and take her somewhere warm until her real family could be contacted. As the vehicle pulled away, Henry turned to watch her. She lifted her hand, fingers shaking but brave, and waved. A tiny gesture, a quiet thank you, a goodbye filled with more meaning than any words she could have spoken. Henry swallowed hard and climbed into the front seat beside the agent. "Let's finish this," he murmured. The SUV merged onto the highway, lights flashing against the endless Arizona sky. Snow-dusted fields stretched for miles. Rest stops passed by in blurs. And in the back seat, Bruno stayed perfectly still, nose lifted, breathing slow and focused, as if already searching for the next clue buried somewhere out there. Because the rescue wasn't just about saving one child. It was about uncovering the truth for all the others who couldn't signal for help. It was about giving closure, justice, and healing, a legacy far greater than a single moment. And on that long stretch of highway, beneath a sky the color of early dusk, a dog with scarred leg and an unbroken spirit carried that mission with devotion no words could describe. The desert highway unfolded before them like a ribbon of faded asphalt stretching into the unknown. The FBI SUV hummed steadily as it cut through the cold morning air, its flashing lights reflecting off road signs and distant patches of snow. Henry stared ahead, jaw tight, mind sharp, but somewhere beneath the hard focus, a quiet prayer moved through him. Let the child they saved be just the beginning. Let there be more hope waiting at the end of this road. Bruno, lying in the back with his body pressed low and his nose lifted to the air, seemed to sense it too. He wasn't simply riding. He was searching, breathing in every changing current of scent that drifted through the slightly open rear vent. His eyes stayed half closed, not in rest but in concentration, as if he were preparing himself for something he already knew was coming. The lead agent glanced into the rear-view mirror. "He's alert," she murmured. Henry nodded. He never shuts down on a case like this. Not until the children are safe. The agent said nothing, but her expression softened. A rare break in her professional composure. For a moment, she wasn't just an investigator. She was a mother or an aunt or a woman who'd seen too many missing child posters taped to too many walls. They turned off the main highway onto a long dirt road, leading toward a cluster of abandoned storage buildings on the outskirts of Winslow. The sun sat low, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Snow clung to the corners of broken windows and the rusted sides of corrugated metal walls. As soon as the SUV came to a stop, Bruno stood. No command needed. "Easy," Henry said softly, opening the back door. "We move together." But Bruno was already scanning the perimeter, ears up, muscles tight, breath quickening. The FBI team formed a tactical formation, weapons holstered but ready, voices low, footsteps soft against the dusty ground. Then it happened. Bruno froze. His head snapped sharply to the left. His nose lifted. His tail stiffened. Henry felt the ripple of energy run through the dog like a current. "You smell something," Henry whispered. Bruno took 2 steps forward, paused, then looked back at Henry with a quick, urgent glance. The same look he'd given earlier, before the truth cracked open in the terminal. The agent nodded. "Let him lead." Bruno surged ahead, moving with a controlled intensity, weaving through old tire tracks and broken fences. The team followed close behind. He led them toward the largest building, the one with boarded windows and a heavy chain hanging from the door. A faint sound reached them, a soft thump, then another, barely audible, more like the echo of a breath than a cry. Bruno's ears twitched. He growled, quiet but certain. Henry's pulse kicked hard against his ribs. "There," he whispered. Agents moved in. Bolt cutters snapped. The chain fell with metallic clang that spilled through the empty desert. They pushed the door open, flashlights cutting through the dim interior. Dust filled the air. Wooden crates lined the walls. A portable heater buzzed weakly in the corner. And near the back, shadows shifted. Then a small face appeared. 2 wide eyes. Then another. And another. 3 children, huddled together, coats too thin for the cold, cheeks streaked with tears. They didn't scream. They didn't run. They just watched the lights approach with a hollow, silent fear of those who had waited far too long for rescue. Bruno walked forward first. Slow, gentle, tail low, ears soft. He approached the children as if approaching wounded birds. No barking, no sudden movements, just presence, the kind that invites trust without asking for it. One of the children, a little boy no older than 8, reached out a trembling hand to touch Bruno's fur. His fingers curled into the warm coat, and he whispered something so small Henry barely heard it. "You came." Those 2 words hit Henry like a punch. The lead agent lowered her flashlight, not wanting to blind them. "It's okay," she said softly. "You're safe. We're going to take you home." The smallest of the children stared at Bruno for a long moment, then leaned into him the same way the girl back at the terminal had. Their tiny shoulders shook with quiet sobs, relief breaking through the fear. Henry swallowed the tightness in his throat. "Bruno," he whispered, voice trembling. "You found them." The dog pressed his head gently against the boy's chest. It was a simple gesture, quiet, soft, unbelievably tender. And yet, it carried the same weight as any heroic act. Because sometimes the greatest rescue isn't the chase or the tackle or the evidence found. It's showing a frightened child that someone came for them, that someone cared, that they mattered enough for a hero to find them. Officers wrapped blankets around the children. The FBI agent radioed for medical support. One child clung to Bruno's neck. Another held Henry's hand. And slowly, carefully, the world began to put itself back together around them. "You saved more than one life today," the agent told Henry quietly. "Your partner," he did something extraordinary. Henry looked at Bruno, his scars, his strength, his impossible heart. "No," Henry said softly. He did what he was born to do. The children, still holding on to Bruno, nodded as if they understood. And in that abandoned building in the middle of the cold Arizona desert, hope returned, quiet, steady, and unbelievably real. The rescue operation at the abandoned warehouse made headlines before the sun had fully set over the Arizona desert. Local news stations broke into regular programming. Social media lit up with photos of the children wrapped in blankets, their faces softened by safety, their small hands gripping the fur of a dog who refused to let them vanish. And as dawn crept into the next day, something stirred across the community. Something bigger than shock, bigger than fear, bigger than the crime itself. It was gratitude. It was pride. It was a collective recognition that heroes sometimes come with gray hair and tired knees, or with scars on their legs and loyalty etched into their bones. Henry didn't notice any of it at first. He spent the morning completing reports, speaking with federal agents, and answering quiet questions from child services about the little girl who had clung to him like he was the only safe person in the world. Every now and then, he found himself glancing down at Bruno, who rested at his feet, head lifted as if ready to stand again at the slightest call. But by mid-afternoon, a deputy entered the station with a look that Henry couldn't quite read. "Officer Carson," he said, clearing his throat, "you and your partner might want to step outside." Henry frowned. "Is something wrong?" The deputy smiled, a soft, almost emotional smile that didn't match the usual tone of the precinct. "Quite the opposite. Come on." Henry clipped the leash to Bruno's harness, though both he and the dog knew it was more formality than necessity. Together, they walked through the station doors and into bright winter sunlight. What they saw stopped Henry in his tracks. The entire front lawn of the police station was filled with people, hundreds of them, families bundled in coats, seniors leaning on canes, children holding handmade signs colored with crayon, local business owners, teachers, veterans, even the mayor. A hush ran through the crowd as Henry stepped forward. Then applause broke out, loud, warm, rolling like a wave of gratitude that shook the cold air itself. Bruno lifted his head, ears perked in confusion, tail giving a small, uncertain wag. Henry blinked, stunned, his throat tightening as emotion climbed higher than he'd expected. He wasn't a man accustomed to the spotlight. He had lived his life serving quietly, without expecting praise. But today was different. A little boy stepped out from the crowd, holding the hand of his mother. The same boy Bruno had found in the warehouse. Wrapped in a new coat, cheeks flush in the cold, he carried a poster almost as big as he was. On it, in uneven handwriting, were 4 simple words. "Thank you, Officer Bruno." Henry swallowed hard. Then the girl from the terminal stepped forward. Now clean, safe, her hair brushed and tied back with a hospital ribbon. She held a small stuffed dog in her arms. Without hesitation, she walked up to Bruno and gently laid the toy at his paws. "For you," she whispered, "because you saved me. And them too." Bruno lowered his head, pressing his nose to the toy. The gesture, simple, gentle, made several people wipe their eyes. The mayor approached, his voice warm and steady. "Officer Carson," he said, "and Bruno, this community owes you more than applause. You didn't just stop a crime. You restored faith. You reminded us that courage doesn't fade with age, and compassion doesn't weaken with hardship. You saved lives." He held out a small plaque, engraved with both of their names. "For extraordinary bravery and service to the children of Arizona." Henry took it slowly, muscles trembling not from age this time, but from the weight of what it meant. He had carried guilt for decades. Guilt for a case he couldn't solve long ago. Guilt for a child he couldn't save. Yet here he was, holding tangible proof that he and Bruno had rewritten that story. A chant rose from the crowd, soft at first, then growing stronger. "Hero Bruno, Hero Bruno." Bruno's ears perked at the sound, and he let out one soft, almost humble bark, as though thanking them in his own way. Henry felt a tear escape, warm and unexpected against his cold cheek. He placed a hand on Bruno's back, letting his voice carry through the winter air. "He's not just my partner," Henry said quietly. "He's the reason those children get to go home tonight. He's a hero." Silence followed, deep, reverent. Then applause erupted again, wrapping the pair in a warmth no winter day could diminish. In that moment, the community didn't just honor Henry and Bruno. They healed something inside them. They reminded themselves that goodness still exists, that courage can come in fur and wrinkles, and that heroes are not defined by perfection, but by the choices they make when no one else sees the truth. A healing legacy had begun. Not just for the rescued children, not just for the town, but for Henry and Bruno themselves. The applause faded slowly, like the last notes of him lingering in a small-town church. People began to step back, giving Henry space, though many remained close enough to watch him with gratitude in their eyes. Bruno sat by his side, tail resting gently on the ground, gaze calm and steady, as if he knew something profound was happening, even if no one had spoken aloud. But inside Henry, something stirred, something old, something he had carried for 3 decades like a weight he believed he deserved. The celebration of that afternoon, the cheers, the plaque, the children hugging Bruno, had warmed the town. But for Henry, it did something else. It touched a place he had kept locked deep inside, where memory and regret had lived side by side in silence. And the key to that door was a pair of frightened children whispering the same words he once failed to hear. "You came." As the crowd slowly dispersed, Henry walked toward the quiet side of the station, seeking a moment alone. The winter light softened, turning the snow-covered ground into a shimmering blanket. He took a slow breath and exhaled, the cold forming a pale cloud in front of him. Bruno followed, pressing his warm body against Henry's leg before sitting down beside him. Henry rested a hand on the dog's head, his fingers sinking into the familiar fur. "You know," Henry whispered, "people keep saying you saved them." His voice trembled. "But you saved me, too." For 30 years, Henry had carried the memory of a little boy he couldn't save, a case that broke him, shaped him, and stayed with him every day since. It was the kind of wound time doesn't erase, the kind that sits beneath the surface of every decision, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. He remembered the mother's scream, the flashing lights, the moment he arrived too late. No amount of service medals, commendations, or years on the force ever filled that void. It was a silence that lived in him, a silence Bruno somehow heard. Henry sat down on the concrete steps, his knees stiff but steady. The sun cast a warm glow along the horizon, melting the edge of the winter chill. He looked out across the parking lot, where hours earlier the community had stood united, celebrating bravery, goodness, and the miracle of a dog's instinct. Bruno shifted, laying his head gently on Henry's knee, and for the first time in 30 years, Henry felt the weight of that old grief loosen, just a little. "It wasn't your fault," a soft voice interrupted. Henry looked up. The FBI agent, the same one who had led the recovery of the children, stood a few steps away, her coat pulled tight against the cold. "Excuse me," Henry asked quietly. She walked closer, her expression gentle. "Earlier, when you talked to the girl, and when you looked at those children, I saw something in your eyes. I've seen it before. Officers who carry ghosts." Henry didn't acknowledge it, but his silence answered for him. She continued, voice steady. "What happened 30 years ago? You didn't fail. The people who took that child did. Evil did. Not you." Henry's throat closed. He looked away. The agent knelt beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. "But today you wrote a new ending. Not just for those children. For yourself." Bruno nudged Henry's hand, insisting he listen. Henry felt his chest tighten, then slowly, carefully, release, not all at once, but enough for him to breathe deeper than he had in years. "You know," the agent added with a small smile, "I've seen a lot of cases, a lot of heartbreak, but I've never seen anything like what your dog did. He didn't just act. He understood." Henry nodded, his voice cracking. "He sees what I miss. He hears what I can't. It's like he knows exactly where the pain is." "He does," she said simply, "because it lives in him too. That's why you're partners." Henry looked down at Bruno. The dog gazed back with eyes full of quiet strength, eyes that held their own past, their own scars, their own silent story. Two souls, both hurt in different ways, both learning to heal through the act of saving others. Henry pressed a gentle hand to Bruno's shoulder. "Thank you," he whispered, not to the agent, not to the world, but to the dog who had helped him reclaim the part of himself he thought was gone forever. The agent stood, giving them space. "Take your time, Henry. Healing takes longer for the ones who care the most." She walked away, leaving Henry and Bruno alone under the fading desert sun. For a moment, everything was still. Then Henry closed his eyes and let the tears come. Not the tears of guilt he had carried for decades, but tears of release. Tears of healing. Tears of a man who finally understood that saving a single child can sometimes save a wounded heart too. Bruno leaned close, resting his head against Henry's chest. Henry wrapped an arm around him gently, letting the warmth of the dog's presence melt the final layer of the ache he had held for 30 years. In that quiet moment, Henry finally let go, not of the memory, not of the past, but of the pain that had overshadowed everything since. And with Bruno beside him, he discovered something he never believed possible. Healing is not forgetting. Healing is remembering without breaking. The sun had dipped low across the Arizona horizon, painting the desert in gentle shades of gold and amber. The air carried that quiet calm that arrives only after a storm has finally passed. And there, on the worn concrete steps outside the station, Henry sat beside Bruno, his partner, his protector, his healer. The long road of the investigation was behind them. The rescued children were safe. The darkness that once existed in silence had been brought into the light. But what lingered now was something deeper, something that didn't belong to law enforcement or the FBI or any official report. It belonged to every heart that had watched Henry and Bruno's story unfold. And as Henry gently scratched behind Bruno's ear, feeling the steady warmth of the dog leaning into him, he knew this wasn't just the end of the case. It was the beginning of a legacy. He whispered softly, almost as if afraid to break the peaceful air. "You brought something back to me, boy. Something I thought I'd lost." Bruno lifted his head, eyes soft and wise, reflecting the quiet desert light. He didn't need words. His presence had always been the answer. Henry inhaled deeply, letting the cold settle in his lungs, grounding him. "For 30 years I carried a story I couldn't rewrite. But today we wrote a new one. Together." From across the lot, the sound of laughter drifted. The children playing in a supervised area, bundled in jackets given to them by the community. They were safe. They were smiling. They were alive. And sometimes, Henry thought, that is all the world needs to begin healing. A small group of local residents passed by the station on their evening walk. They offered Henry soft waves, gentle smiles, and nods of respect. The quiet kind reserved for people who had done something extraordinary without asking for recognition. One elderly man paused, hand tucked into the pocket of his flannel coat. "Officer Carson," he said, his voice wore with age and gratitude. "There are folks around here who will sleep a little easier tonight because of you and that dog." Henry nodded, humbled. "Thank you." After the man walked on, Henry looked at Bruno again, letting the moment settle. This quiet acknowledgement, this gratitude, this healing was a heart of the American spirit. Not loud, not grand, not wrapped in ceremony, but honest, steady, born from neighbors looking out for one another, from people choosing courage in small places, from the belief that even a single act of goodness can ripple far beyond its moment. As the sky deepened into twilight, Henry spoke softly, more to himself than anyone else. "You know, in this country we talk a lot about heroes. We picture badges, uniforms, maybe even capes." He paused, brushing a bit of dust from Bruno's fur. "But sometimes heroes walk on four paws and carry the kind of heart we spend a lifetime trying to understand." Bruno nudged Henry's hand gently, as if affirming the thought. "And sometimes," Henry continued, voice thick with quiet emotion, "healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from finding one single moment that reminds you there is still goodness in the world." He lifted his gaze to the open sky, its last band of sunlight stretching thin across the desert. "Today was that moment for me." A soft breeze moved across the lot, carrying with the faint rustle of dry grass and the peaceful hum of a town settling into night. Henry stood slowly, his joints stiff but his spirit lighter than it had been in decades. "Come on, partner," he said gently. "Let's go home." Bruno rose, trotting at Henry's side with the dignity of a seasoned guardian. And as the two of them walked toward the patrol car, silhouetted by the final glow of evening, they carried with them something precious. A reminder that healing is possible at any age. A reminder that courage can be quiet. And a reminder that love, loyalty, and instinct can rewrite even the deepest pain. Before opening the car door, Henry paused and looked back toward the station, toward the children, toward the community that had stood with him. He felt a warmth settle into his chest, steady and real. "This world can be hard," he murmured, the words shaped by years of experience and worn wisdom. "But as long as there are hearts like his," he looked down at Bruno, "we're not done yet. There is still hope." Bruno wagged his tail once, slow and certain. And that was enough. Because sometimes the strongest American truth is this: we heal not by forgetting the past, but by finding someone who walks beside us through it.